Question 6 is a critical thinking question. If we look to the end, we're being asked, which one of the following best expresses the main conclusion of the argument? So we have to identify the conclusion within the argument. So let's go through it. Agriculture faces its biggest challenge since Neolithic days in the way it adapts or fails to adapt to climate change. Africa and Southeast Asia will be worse affected. In 20 years' time, the climate will be quite different from the climate today. Crop varieties used now will yield dramatically less in the changed conditions. Famine and higher food prices will follow. To avert this disaster, we need to develop worldwide seed banks with detailed catalogues showing the traits of each variety and the resistances they have to heat, soil saturation or drought. Farmers can then begin to trial crops and prepare for the future. Seed banks are not the only answer to the impending famine, but they are an achievable first step. So before we look at the potential conclusions, let's have a look over the argument. Agriculture is facing a massive challenge, which is climate change. Africa and Southeast Asia will be most affected. Crop yield may well decrease in some crops we use right now, and that will lead to famine and high food prices. To avert this, we need worldwide seed banks and a detailed catalogue of resistances, which farmers can then use to trial crops and prepare, and that this isn't the only answer, it's an achievable first step. Okay, let's move on to statement A, which says that agriculture is facing its biggest challenge since Neolithic times. Now, is this the main conclusion of the argument? It's in fact exactly the same as the first line, but the first line doesn't really summarise the conclusion of the argument. The conclusion of the argument drawing towards the necessity for action to be taken, for seed banks to be made, for catalogues to be delivered to farmers. So this appears to be more of like an editorialising statement to introduce the argument rather than the main conclusion. So this is not our conclusion. Now option B says that seed banks will avert famine caused by climate change. Now this goes far beyond what's stated in the piece. The piece is much more reserved. In fact, it says that seed banks are not the only answer to famine, they're an achievable first step. Option B says the conclusion of the argument is that catalogue seed banks should be created and their contents trialled. Now this spans these two lines here, that to avert climate change, which is the concerning thing introduced in the first line, we need these worldwide seed banks and we need a detailed catalogue of resistances so that farmers can trial and prepare. So this seems to be drawing a synthesis of the argument being made, taking into account the crisis we're facing, as well as what needs to be done, so we can say that this is our main conclusion. Option D says that the conclusion of the argument is that farmers in Africa and Southeast Asia should begin trialling different varieties of crops. Now, although this is something that's mentioned as something that should definitely be done, the reason that this can't be done is because we need to build the worldwide seed banks first and a detailed catalogue of resistances from which the farmers can draw the necessary seeds and trial their crops. So this is an important first step as established in the final line. So this skips a step, so it isn't the main conclusion of the argument. Finally, option E says that crops used today will be unable to grow in new climatic conditions later in the century. Although concerns were raised that in 20 years the climate will change and crop yields will decrease, there isn't something to suggest in the piece, at least, that crops used today will not be able to grow. It may just be the case that, for example, the roots or the flowering part or whatever the main part of the crop is, which is marketable, will not grow in the way it should, or that maybe it's more susceptible to pests or other things which would decrease the yield but not necessarily affect its growth, so to speak. So we've reached our conclusion that the answer is C, that catalogue seed banks should be created and their contents trialled by farmers.